The presidential election in the spring of 1932 had gone to Hindenburg, who was offering security instead of Hitler's radical Nazi program. And Hindenburg's government immediately banned political uniforms in Germany, and he also banned the SS and the stormtroopers. However, there were soon twice as many unemployed, and in the summer of 1932, the SS and the stormtroopers started a riot in Hamburg that they called Bloody Sunday, and the Horst Wessel song was being sung by the victors. Horst Wessel was a 22-year-old brown shirt who'd fallen in love with a girl named Erna, and she was a year older than Horst and had recently broken up with a 31-year-old communist whose nickname was Ali. The spurned Ali didn't want to end his love affair with Erna, and when she insisted, Ali called her a prostitute, and when Horst moved into Erna's apartment with her, the landlady tried to evict him because she liked communists and missed Ali. The landlady was Ali's age, and the communist ex-boyfriend hated Erna for picking up with a young privileged German student, and on the 14th of February, Ali sent a dozen communists to murder Horst Wessel, who would linger in the hospital until the 23rd of February in 1930. The young communists and the young Nazis had loved to hate each other, and they engaged in territory battles like any young gang of thugs. But Horst's murder was taken up as a banner by the Nazis because Horst Wessel had been very active in the Nazi circles and was a favorite to many of the brown shirts. Horst had written a poem called "Raise High the Flag" that the Nazis had set to music, and the original words of the tune were, "And as your eye met mine, and as my lips kissed yours, then did love enshroud us." PUTSCH said the music was like a Vienna cabaret song, and that the Nazis had, quote, "hotted up the tune to march time," close quote. Adolf Hitler, Volume 1 by John Toland, New York, Doubleday and Company, 1976, page 249. When the police would show up to break up the fights between the youthful communists and the youthful Nazis, often they'd join forces and run away together, and both sides had once marched together to protest a ban on marching. The Nazis gave Horst Wessel a huge funeral, and Goebbels himself stood by the graveside to call the roll of the stormtroopers, and when it came time for Horst Wessel, they all shouted "Present," and they brought out the Nazi flag that had blood on it from the beer hall putsch, and thereafter members would swear the sacred oath to Hitler while grasping that blood-stained flag. The Horst Wessel song became the official anthem of the party, and while the young people had some fun with the gang fights, the older soldiers who'd been in the trenches of the Great War were deadly serious about it. On the 20th of July in 1932, General von Rundstedt declared martial law in Berlin, which was just what the Nazis needed to win votes. And elections at the end of the month were a stunning victory for them, with almost 14 million popular votes and 230 seats in the Reichstag. And as well as being the largest party by far, the Nazis heralded over 1 million registered party members, along with 400,000 SS and stormtroopers. In August of 1932, after his landslide win in the elections, Hitler retreated to the Eagle's Nest to wait for a summons from Berlin. The next election in November failed to diminish the popularity of the Nazis, and on the 16th of December in 1932, a banker named Schroeder from Cologne asked the German government to appoint Hitler to something important to satisfy the Nazis, and so Hitler and some government officials were invited to come to the holy city of Cologne on the Rhine right after the New Year in 1933, where Schroeder told Hitler he would become Chancellor if only he were willing to keep it a secret for now. Hitler had arrived in Cologne on a secret train, and so the Third Reich was quietly born there, where the Magi were buried in the largest reliquary in the Western world at Cologne's Roman Catholic Cathedral Church of St. Peter. The cathedral in Cologne had taken over 600 years to build, and when it was completed in 1880, it had been the tallest building in the world until the construction of the Washington Monument in America, and the cathedral in Cologne would take over a dozen direct hits during Hitler's war, but would remain standing while the entire city was flattened. In 1933 in Cologne, the bankers and the corporations gave Hitler money, but they made it a loan, and they wanted Hitler in power so they could get their money back, since the communists in Russia had defaulted and refused to pay back any of the loans made to the Tsar before they murdered him. Thus the bankers and corporations were steadfastly behind Hitler, who also had the support of some very prominent British Jews, some of whom also happened to be in the banking business. 3 million Englishmen had been unemployed in 1931, and the Crown had been unable to pay both unemployment and reparations to America. So they had cut the wages to common Englishmen and decreased their benefits, and when this failed to improve the British economy, the Crown had gone off the gold standard. Britain had gone along with dismissing German reparations in 1932 in hopes that Germany could now afford to buy British goods, and when Hitler claimed credit for Germany's improved economic picture, that had gotten his party elected in the landslide. 2 weeks after the meeting with Schroeder in Cologne, the Nazis had a big win in an election in Lippe on the 15th of January in 1933, the province that included Minden, after a whirlwind speaking tour by Hitler. And Hitler met with Hindenburg at Ribbentrop's house in Berlin on the 10th, the 18th, and the 22nd of January. And the final meeting was kept most secret, as Hindenburg and a friend and their wives went to the opera to hear Wagner, then snuck out the side door during the show to take a taxi to Ribbentrop's, and Hindenburg and his friend exited the taxi several blocks away and walked through the deep snow to make the meeting. By the 24th of January, they all agreed to make Hitler the Chancellor, and the announcement was made on the 30th of January, but it was supposed to be a coalition government, and the Reichstag went up in flames on the 27th of February and was blamed on the communists, and the next day an emergency order allowed Nazis to detain people in protective custody without cause. Most of the Nazis' opposition were either murdered or arrested by the 4th of March in 1933, and Hitler announced that there would be new elections on the 5th of March, but the Nazis still did not win a majority of the popular votes and won a bare majority in the Reichstag, so they started arresting government officials and appointing Nazis in their place, and those they arrested were put into army barracks and warehouses surrounded by barbed wire, which was the beginning of the concentration camps. On the 21st of March, Hitler ordered the Festival of Potsdam Day to celebrate when the Second Reich had begun, with Bismarck opening the Reichstag in 1871, and a ceremony was held in the church where Frederick II the Great and Frederick I called Barbarossa were buried. At the Treaty of Versailles in Frankfurt in 1871, France had lost Alsace-Lorraine, and France had been forced to pay $1 billion to Germany, and German troops had stayed in France until they got their money. The former Kaiser had been listening to Hitler's speeches on the radio from his exile in Holland, and he sent a telegram to Hitler on Potsdam Day saying how proud he was of Hitler's good work. And 3 days later, the enabling law was passed in the Reichstag, and the Nazis called it the Law for Terminating the Suffering of People and Nation. The enabling law passed 441 to 94, but Hitler cheated to get that majority by making promises before the vote that he did not keep, and the enabling law made the provinces subject to the state, using the term Gleichrichter, which also meant an electrical rectifier, and Hitler made the Jewish boycott permanent on April Fool's Day. To replace the Communists' May Day commemoration, the Nazis held National Labor Day at the Tempelhof airfield, and everyone had the day off to make sure they attended, and 200,000 people were lit by 130 aircraft searchlights, and the eagle on the top of the stadium had a 100-foot wingspan. The rally was so well organized that everyone knew exactly what to do and where to eat and sleep, and the crowd cheered and watched fireworks, and the next day all union leaders were arrested, and their newspapers were shut down, and their bank accounts were seized, and the rioting and sabotage that followed was not done by Nazis or by communists, but by union bosses wanting to get their jobs back. People had been disappearing into basements of police stations, and by July, all the labor unions and the unapproved newspapers and any other political party were made illegal. By November of 1933, the Reichstag was 95.2% Nazis, and the first thing they did was appoint Fritz Todt as the Inspector General of German Roadways to begin building the Autobahn, and that project was quickly followed by a plan to fortify the West Wall to keep out the perfidious Brits and their hapless allies. President Hindenburg died in August of 1934, and Hitler joined the office of the Chancellery with that of the presidency to become Germany's sole holy leader, and a national referendum on the 19th of August confirmed that the Germans wanted Hitler to be their blessed Führer. In Germany, even teachers were civil servants, and all civil servants had to take the Nazi oath or lose their job, and Hitler banned the book All Quiet on the Western Front so young Germans wouldn't think war was bad. Germany had been blamed for the Great War and was told to pay for all the damage done, and Poland, France, and Belgium had been given some German land in the aftermath, and Britain had screwed with the Treaty of Versailles to keep France from getting ahead, and didn't want France to get enough money from Germany to buy military equipment that could be used to invade England. While Germany was supposed to be paying France, the British were insisting the Germans pay France in goods rather than in gold, and when Germany failed to send the agreed amount of lumber to France in September of 1922, the Americans pulled out of the Rhineland and allowed the French to march in, and the German workers in the Rhineland immediately went out on strike. Business under the British model had slowed to a crawl, and historically, the Crown of England survived by owning land all over the world and selling titles to rich noble offspring willing to relocate and pay a substantial price for the land, and then funnel taxes back towards the Crown. English who bought some small country like New Hampshire or New York would then charge taxes to the locals and keep a little for themselves before sending the lion's share back home to the Crown. The American colonists had not only been taxed by their titled landlords, but were paying an English tax every time merchants traded with the home country, and the British Crown would keep its overseas nobles honest by refusing to send troops to protect these English nobles whenever the locals protested paying too high taxes imposed by the landlords. The large English estates in America were not wealthy enough to afford their own police forces, and the Crown in 1770 had simply been overextended because of its conflict with France and could not offer the British American colonies much help. When Napoleon tried to bring democracy to Europe, England was left as the only country with enough money to lend after the Napoleonic Wars failed to liberate Europe from its nobility, leaving destruction in its wake. And while the Crown Bank was actually owned by the King of England, in America, the Founding Fathers had decided that the king should not own the country, but that private individuals must be free to own their own papers and possessions, inviolate from the king. Americans believed that use of a common currency in compliance with common laws was better than rule by whim of an often insane king or by his appointed agents, and America decided that the rule of law of the marketplace, along with an equal right to use the currency, would guide the American path to prosperity. In early America, when taxes had become too high, the Americans simply refused to pay, and so the Crown had declared war on them. Half of England had a soft spot in their hearts for the Americans, if only to admire them for standing up for themselves like good Englishmen. And King George assumed the Americans had spent too much time away from civilization, and so he commanded that the Americans be treated like the rest of the savages under colonial rule, and ordered his British troops to fire at will upon the Americans. The colonists had taken sides and were split between support for the English crown because they were decent Englishmen, or wanting to fight for freedom. And when the crown hired German soldiers to fight the Americans, the tide turned against Britain. Frederick II the Great was in power in Germany from 1740 to 1786. At the time, America was finding its independence, and there were so many Americans of German descent that hiring their brethren to fight the crown's wars had been the final insult to the colonists. The language of American English was born as soon as the crown no longer had the authority to burn books printed in the U.S. just because they didn't like what was said in them, and an American newspaperman had been put on trial in an English court in 1735 for printing bad things about the governor of New York, but an American jury had set him free on the grounds that he'd told the truth. Benjamin Franklin became the voice of America by putting Americans' opinions into print, and he wrote Poor Richard's Almanac that anybody could read because it was in the style and language of the common people, and Franklin also invented the Pennsylvania fireplace that circulated warm air back into the room, but he refused to patent it as a gift for the good of humanity. George Washington had suffered the smallpox and was scarred for life. And Washington hadn't gone to school in England like all the other rich American plantation owners, so he was a free thinker who believed in an independent federal American republic. George Washington gathered an army of his own, dressed them in better blue than the English red, and asked the U.S. Congress to either support the war effort or side with the British Crown, and by one single vote the U.S. Congress supported George Washington's army. The books Thomas Jefferson had been reading told him basically three things: that people were fundamentally good, given the opportunity, and that government was contractual, meaning that it was based on the consent of the governed. The main difference between America and Britain was that the Founding Fathers believed that God gave people inalienable rights that could not be abridged or amended by government, while Britain believed that God had given them a king. And Jefferson also thought, thirdly, that God was more scientific than not. The British governor had been a pushover because when the Americans didn't like what he was doing, they would tell him that they couldn't pay his salary. The British King George III wanted to charge America a stiff fee for saving the colonies from the French, but the Americans said they'd rather fight the French themselves than have to pay England, and America had no quarrel with France, while Benedict Arnold would become a traitor because he hated the French. The British Empire had grown by private English charter companies sailing forth to seek their fortune, where they often ran into Frenchmen, and the British charter companies would build colonies not as the result of military excursions, which the British often lost, but by licensed companies who would sally forth to set up shop, and then the British military would come later to build forts to protect them, because taxes paid by the charter companies were considerably larger than the taxes that could be squeezed out of the common English working man. With this blueprint, British mercantilism became the standard for the empire, and the charter companies that were creating colonies needed in turn to borrow money to stay in business because they often failed to turn a profit due to high overhead and the ever-present danger of pirates and other barbarians living around the seven seas. If the colonies were extinguished, there would be no taxes coming back to the crown, so sending British soldiers to protect charter companies and their employees was a lucrative and mutually beneficent enterprise for the crown. The American Founding Fathers wanted to tax commerce, not farms, and when America started an income tax in 1861, the South was angered because only those with an income over $800 were taxed at 3%, rising to a 10% tax on incomes over $10,000, so the lion's share of taxes would come from plantation owners, not from the northern factory workers. London survived by the banking business, and being able to borrow from the Bank of England was preferred to borrowing from an international bank, because the British military was in the business of protecting its currency in all its far-flung realms, and English merchants would borrow capital to sail forth, or not borrow but acquire it along the way. And when price fixing or tariffs interfered heavily with private trade, the crown would become the sole buyer and seller in the market, and that monopoly could be enforced on the high seas by the Royal Navy. Germany could not sail to the Atlantic from the port of Danzig because Denmark sat in the way, and the Danish straits were too easy for the Royal Navy to blockade. So from Hanover on the western side of Denmark, the Germans had built a series of canals that led right through from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, joining Germany's port of Danzig to the Atlantic Ocean. The main canal that was enlarged into the Kaiser Kiel Canal, cutting through the base of Denmark, was fed by the Elbe River, so whoever controlled Hanover could control Germany, and that's why the House of Hanover had been created in 1707. The French had invaded Hanover during the 7 Years' War in 1763, but the British had driven them out, and during the Napoleonic Wars, Hanover had again been occupied by the French, and the nobility in Hanover had fled to London to conspire with Prussia and Austria, even though Britain had been at war with these Germans at the time. From London, the Hanoverians formed an army called the King's German Legion, so they could fight Napoleon, and these Germans would play a major role in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Vienna had become the Constantinople of the North, and after the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna in 1814 was the first global trade convention held in Vienna that was at the crossroads of the marketplace where the Danube River ran out into the plains. Paris was no longer the center of the universe by 1814, having gained its former glory due to the great Roman roads radiating outward from the city towards all the capitals and ports of Europe. And after Napoleon tried to bring democracy to the world, Britain sat out the Congress of Vienna, and their refusal to participate allowed the British to spend the following Victorian century without having to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. Queen Victoria would live until January of 1901, and the national debt of Britain in 1815 had been 9 times what it had cost to fight the War of American Independence. The Crimean adventure would not be very expensive because France was made to pay the lion's share of the bill, and the Crimean War was necessary cover for Britain's quelling of the Indian mutiny in the British East India Company's poppy plantations. If Britain were allied with France in the Crimea to fight Russia to keep the Tsar from interfering in the opium trade, then as British allies the French would not be able to meddle in what was now British India after the Carnatic Wars had ended in France's defeat. The British had a terrible time trying to teach the Indians in India to enforce military rank because of their religious caste system, and the British sent tens of thousands of soldiers as part of the Crimean deployment, taking India away from the East India Company, and Victoria would give railroads to the Indians, and they would call her queen. Victoria gave her navy the ability to protect the currency rather than merely saving East India Company employees, and under Victoria the Royal Navy perfected gunboat diplomacy, while before, under the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, the English ships had operated mostly as private pirates. Victoria regulated the charter companies by granting or withholding licenses in order to protect the British pound sterling, and the Royal Navy was now in the business of regulating trade, and its payroll was increased to include the food and accommodations of military officers living on deserted islands. The Royal Navy became a protection racket that would stay in port only so long as the local companies paid enough to shore them up. So when the Japanese started moving into islands in the Pacific in the 1930s, where the British had built outposts, They found only a family or two manning these stations because the British Empire in the 30s was operating on the cheap. On board a Royal Navy ship a good few years ago in the North Atlantic in winter, somebody remarked in a casual conversation, "Nobody at home has any real idea of what the Navy does in peacetime. When visitors come on board, they drink whatever's going, usually in the mistaken belief that it's paid for by the taxpayer, and think we spend our time in a round of cocktail parties with a bit of gentle cruising in between." The Decline of British Sea Power by Desmond Wettern, London Jane's Publishing Company Limited, 1982, in introduction. The Japanese invaded China in 1931 to stop Chinese workers from striking in British and Japanese factories, and labor unions operated on the market principle that if there were a monopoly on labor, the unions could demand decent wages, but the company owners had a different view. The magnates had a rationale for their low-wage policy. If the men were paid more, they said, they would only waste more of their wages on whiskey, beer, tobacco, and gambling, and painted ladies. The Rockefeller Syndrome by Ferdinand Lundberg, New York, Kensington Publishing Company, 1975, page 179. Tax evasion in England was a passionate quest in the sporting culture of the fox-hunting classes, and British royalty believed it to be their duty to look after the coal miners and the English peasants, because the servants and the darkies and the women were dependent on the good grace of these overlords. So, with true good intentions, the crown system believed that the common people could not govern themselves, and that overlordship was a necessary fact of life in the best interests of their dependents. The French had been governing themselves well enough ever since they'd chopped off Marie Antoinette's head, while across the Channel the system of class separation in England was made obvious in the polarization of the House of Lords against the House of Commons, a separation too entrenched in Britain for any hope of change, short of some global conflagration, which was shortly to be visited upon them.